Steve Rogers stood at the edge of the helicarrier's observation deck, watching the sun rise over New York City. The shield on his back felt heavier than usual, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. 70 years had passed since he'd been pulled from the ice, and every day since had been a battle, not just against enemies, but against time itself. The city below buzzed with morning activity. People hurried to work, children walked to school, and life continued as it always had. They had no idea that their peaceful morning was about to shatter. Steve's earpiece crackled to life, pulling him from his thoughts. "Captain, we have a situation," came Nick Fury's voice, urgent and commanding. Multiple energy signatures appearing across the globe. "This isn't like anything we've seen before." Steve turned from the window, his jaw set with determination. "What kind of signatures?" "Unknown origin, massive power levels. They're appearing in major population centers worldwide. London, Tokyo, Mumbai, Sao Paulo. We're talking about potential extinction-level events here, Rogers." The weight of responsibility pressed down on Steve's shoulders. He'd carried this burden for so long, protecting a world that sometimes didn't want to be saved. His body was tired, his spirit worn thin by decades of endless conflict. The super soldier serum had given him enhanced strength and longevity, but it couldn't heal the deeper wounds that came from watching everyone he'd ever loved grow old and die while he remained unchanged. "Assemble the team," Steve said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew this felt different. There was something final about this moment, something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel: fear. Within minutes, the helicarrier's briefing room filled with Earth's mightiest heroes. Tony Stark stood at the holographic display, his face uncharacteristically serious. Natasha Romanoff leaned against the wall, her green eyes sharp and calculating. Thor gripped his hammer tightly, sensing the cosmic disturbance that threatened their realm. Bruce Banner sat quietly, fighting to keep the Hulk at bay as anxiety filled the room. "The energy readings are off the charts," Tony explained, manipulating the hologram to show global hotspots. "These aren't weapons or natural phenomena. They're tears in reality itself. Something is trying to break through from another dimension." Steve studied the display, his tactical mind processing the information. 12 locations, all major cities, all appearing simultaneously. The coordination required for such an attack was staggering. This wasn't random chaos. This was calculated annihilation. "Can we close them?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Tony shook his head grimly. "Not from here. Each tear would need to be sealed from the inside, and the energy levels suggest that anyone entering those rifts might not survive the experience. The dimensional barriers are unstable. One wrong move, and the tears could expand exponentially." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. 12 rifts meant they needed to split their forces, but the Avengers were already spread thin. Recent battles had taken their toll, and several team members were recovering from injuries. They simply didn't have enough people to cover every location effectively. Steve closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of command. Every mission required him to make impossible choices, to send his friends into danger while carrying the burden of their potential sacrifice. But this time felt different. The stakes were higher than they'd ever been, and something deep in his gut told him that not everyone would make it home. "We'll need to coordinate with international forces," he said finally, "but the Avengers will take the most dangerous locations. Tony, you and Rhodey handle Tokyo and Sao Paulo. Thor, you with me in London. Natasha and Clint take Mumbai and Cairo." "What about the other locations?" Bruce asked, his voice strained with barely controlled tension. "We trust our allies," Steve replied, though the words felt hollow. He was asking local heroes and military forces to face threats that even the Avengers might not survive. It went against every instinct he had as a leader, but there simply wasn't another choice. As the team prepared to depart, Steve found himself staring once again at his reflection in the polished surface of his shield. The face that looked back at him was tired, marked by years of conflict and loss. He thought about Peggy Carter, about Bucky Barnes, about all the people he'd failed to save over the years. The shield bore the scratches and dents of countless battles. each mark a reminder of the price of heroism. "You ready for this, Cap?" Tony asked, approaching with his suit already materializing around him. Steve lifted the shield and secured it to his arm. The familiar weight was both comforting and crushing. "I'm ready," he said, though deep in his heart, he wondered if this time, being ready would be enough. The helicarrier's engines roared to life as they prepared for what might be their final mission. Steve Rogers, the man out of time, stood ready to face an enemy that threatened not just his world, but reality itself. The soldier who had sacrificed everything for duty was about to discover that sometimes the greatest sacrifice was yet to come. The Quinjet streaked through storm clouds over London as Steve and Thor approached the dimensional rift. Below them, the ancient city was in chaos. The tear in reality hung suspended above the Thames, a writhing wound in the sky that pulsed with otherworldly energy. Through the rift, they could see glimpses of another realm, dark and twisted, where impossible geometries defied human understanding. "The barrier grows weaker," Thor observed, his voice carrying the weight of cosmic knowledge. "Soon, the creatures from that realm will pour through in numbers we cannot hope to contain." Steve gripped the Quinjet's controls tighter as they descended toward the evacuation zone. British forces had cordoned off a 5-mile radius around the rift, but their weapons were useless against the entities that had already begun seeping through. These weren't creatures of flesh and blood, but beings of pure malevolent energy that consumed everything they touched. "How long do we have?" Steve asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Minutes, perhaps less," Thor replied. "I can feel the realm beyond calling to its children. They hunger for our world's life force." The Quinjet touched down on Westminster Bridge, where General Patricia Hayes of the British Armed Forces waited with grim determination. Her uniform was singed, her face streaked with soot from the ongoing battle to evacuate civilians. "Captain Rogers," she said, saluting despite the chaos around them. "We've evacuated most of the immediate area, but there are still civilians trapped in the underground stations." The creatures seemed drawn to large gatherings of people. Steve nodded, already formulating a plan. "Thor, you work on weakening the rift from this side. I'll coordinate the evacuation efforts and buy us time." "Steve," Thor said, catching his arm as he moved to leave. "The energy signatures from that realm are unlike anything I have encountered, even in my travels through the 9 realms. If we enter that rift to seal it from within, we may not return." For a moment, Steve met his friend's eyes, seeing the concern there. Thor had lived for centuries, had seen civilizations rise and fall, had fought battles across the cosmos. If he was worried, then the situation was truly dire. "Then we make sure our sacrifice counts," Steve replied simply. The next hour was a blur of desperate action. Steve coordinated rescue efforts while fighting off the shadow creatures that poured from the rift in increasing numbers. His shield cut through their dark forms, but for each one he destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. The creatures moved like living nightmares, shifting and writhing as they consumed everything in their path. In the London Underground, Steve found himself face to face with true horror. A group of tourists had been trapped when the creatures first appeared, and now they huddled in a maintenance tunnel while shadows pressed in from all sides. Among them was a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, clutching a small Union Jack flag she'd bought as a souvenir. "Are you really Captain America?" she asked, her voice small but brave despite the terror surrounding them. "I am," Steve replied, kneeling beside her as his shield deflected another attack. "And I'm going to get you out of here safely. I promise." The girl smiled, and in that moment, Steve felt the full weight of why he fought. Not for governments or ideologies, but for moments like this. For the simple right of children to grow up in a world where they could buy souvenir flags and believe in heroes. The evacuation was successful, but it came at a cost. Each rescued civilian meant exposure to more creatures. Each moment of delay allowed the rift to grow stronger. By the time they'd cleared the immediate area, the tear in reality had doubled in size, and the energy readings were approaching critical levels. "Captain," came Tony's voice over the comm, strained and urgent. "Sao Paulo's rift just exploded outward. We barely contained it, but Rhodey's down. The pattern's accelerating worldwide, Steve felt his heart sink. Rhodey was tough as nails, and if he'd been taken out, it meant these entities were more dangerous than they'd anticipated. Reports flooded in from around the globe. Heroes falling, military forces overwhelmed, entire city blocks consumed by expanding rifts. "Thor, we're out of time," Steve said, watching as the London rift pulsed with increasing intensity. "We need to go in now before it's too late." The Thunder God nodded grimly. "I have studied the energy patterns. There's a core somewhere beyond that portal, a source that feeds all the rifts simultaneously. If we can reach it and destroy it, we might be able to seal all the tiers at once." "Might?" Steve asked. "The dimensional barriers are fragile. Destroying the core could either seal the rifts or cause them to collapse catastrophically, taking portions of our reality with them. It is a gamble with the highest possible stakes." Steve looked back at London, at the millions of people counting on them to succeed. In the distance, he could see the lights of the city, each one representing lives that hung in the balance. His shield felt heavier than ever as he realized what needed to be done. "Then we'd better make sure we win that gamble," he said. As they prepared to enter the rift, Steve activated his communicator one final time. "This is Captain America to all stations," he said, his voice carrying across the global network. "Thor and I are entering the London rift to attempt to destroy the source. If we succeed, all rifts should seal simultaneously. If we fail—" He paused, thinking of all the people who had believed in him over the years, all the lives he'd touched, all the sacrifices that had brought them to this moment. "If we fail, then it's been an honor serving alongside all of you. Keep fighting. Never give up. And remember what we're fighting for." The rift loomed before them, a gateway to nightmare that pulsed with malevolent hunger. Steve Rogers, the man who had always carried the hopes of others on his shoulders, stepped forward into the unknown. Behind him, the world held its breath, and ahead of him, destiny waited in the darkness. The moment Steve and Thor crossed the threshold of the rift, reality became a fluid concept. They found themselves falling through layers of existence, each one more alien than the last. Colors that had no names painted impossible landscapes, while gravity shifted and twisted around them like a living thing. Steve's enhanced senses, so reliable in the physical world, screamed warnings that his mind struggled to process. "Stay close," Thor shouted over the dimensional storm that raged around them. Lightning from his hammer provided the only familiar light in this realm of chaos. "The pathways here shift constantly. One wrong turn could scatter us across infinite realities." Steve nodded, fighting the disorientation that threatened to overwhelm him. His shield, that symbol of protection and justice, felt strangely warm against his arm, as if it were reacting to the otherworldly energies surrounding them. The metal seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, steady and reassuring like a heartbeat in the madness. They landed on what appeared to be solid ground, though it rippled like water beneath their feet. The landscape before them defied description. Towering spires of crystallized screams pierced a sky that bled colors of despair, while in the distance, forests of bone-white trees swayed to winds that carried the echoes of destroyed worlds. "This realm feeds on suffering," Thor observed, his voice heavy with the weight of cosmic understanding. "Every creature that enters becomes fuel for its expansion into our dimension." As if summoned by his words, the shadow beings began to emerge from the twisted landscape. But here, in their home realm, they were far more dangerous. These weren't the diminished forms that had seeped through the rifts, but creatures of pure malevolent will, towering entities that moved with purpose and intelligence. Steve raised his shield as the first wave attacked. The creatures struck with the force of collapsing stars, each impact sending shockwaves through his enhanced frame. His shield, forged from vibranium and tempered by decades of battle, held against assaults that should have shattered any earthly metal. But with each deflected attack, Steve felt the cumulative toll on his body growing. There, Thor pointed toward a massive structure in the distance, a spire that seemed to be built from the crystallized essence of the dimensional rifts themselves. "The core lies within that tower. I can feel it calling to the tiers in our reality." The journey to the tower became a running battle through a nightmare landscape. Steve's tactical mind, honed by years of warfare, worked to find patterns in their enemies' attacks. But these creatures fought with a coordination that suggested a single controlling intelligence, adapting to their strategies almost instantly. As they fought their way closer to the spire, Steve began to notice changes in himself. The otherworldly energies of this realm were affecting him on a fundamental level. His enhanced healing was working overtime to repair damage from attacks that seemed to target not just his body, but his very essence as a living being. "Steve," Thor called out during a brief respite between waves of attackers, "this realm is designed to break the will of its victims. It will show you your greatest failures, your deepest regrets. You must not allow it to consume your spirit." Even as Thor spoke the warning, the landscape around them began to shift. The alien geometry twisted and reformed, and suddenly Steve found himself standing not in the nightmare realm, but in the familiar corridors of the helicarrier. But this wasn't the ship as it existed in reality. This was the helicarrier as it had appeared in his darkest moments of failure. Phantom figures materialized around him. Bucky Barnes, falling from the train in the Alps. Peggy Carter, growing old and dying while he remained frozen in ice. Countless soldiers who had followed his orders into battle and never returned home. Each specter whispered accusations, reminded him of choices that had cost lives, of victories that had come at too high a price. "You failed us, Steve." Bucky's voice echoed through the corridor, though Steve knew it wasn't really his oldest friend speaking. "How many more will die because you couldn't save us?" Steve closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every loss, every sacrifice that others had made for his mission. The guilt threatened to crush him, to paralyze him with the magnitude of his perceived failures. But then he remembered the little girl in the London Underground, clutching her souvenir flag and believing in heroes. "I didn't fail you," Steve said firmly, opening his eyes and looking directly at the phantom Bucky. "I honored you. Every life I've saved, every battle I've fought, has been to make sure your sacrifice meant something." The illusions shattered around him, revealing the alien landscape once more. Thor stood nearby, his own eyes clearing from whatever visions the realm had shown him. They exchanged a nod of understanding, both having faced their demons and emerged stronger. The base of the spire loomed before them now, its surface crawling with energy that hurt to look at directly. As they approached, Steve could feel the pull of the rifts, could sense the tears in reality that were slowly consuming his world. Every second they delayed meant more destruction, more lives lost. "The entrance," Thor said, pointing to an opening in the spire's base that seemed to absorb light itself. "Beyond the threshold lies either salvation or damnation for both our worlds." Steve checked his shield one final time, ensuring the straps were secure. The vibranium surface bore new scratches from their journey through the nightmare realm, each mark a testament to battles fought in defense of everything he held dear. "Then we'd better make sure it's salvation," he replied. As they entered the spire, the walls around them pulsed with the heartbeat of cosmic horror. The air itself seemed alive, pressing against them with malevolent intent. Each step forward required tremendous will, as if the very structure were designed to repel any force that might threaten its existence. The passage spiraled upward, defying architectural logic as it twisted through dimensions that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. With each level they climbed, the pressure increased, and Steve began to understand that this wasn't just a physical journey, but a test of everything that made him who he was. At the heart of the spire, something waited for them, something ancient and hungry, something that had been reaching across the void between realities for eons, searching for worlds to consume. Steve Rogers, the man who had never backed down from a fight, prepared to face the ultimate enemy, a force that sought not just to defeat him, but to unmake the very concept of hope itself. The final battle was about to begin, and the fate of all realities hung in the balance. The core chamber of the spire defied every law of physics Steve had ever known. The space seemed impossibly vast, stretching beyond the horizon in all directions, yet somehow contained within the narrow tower they had climbed. At the center of this paradox hung a massive entity, a writhing mass of pure malevolent consciousness that pulsed with the stolen life force of countless consumed worlds. The Devourer, as Steve instinctively knew it was called, turned its attention toward them. It had no true form, instead existing as a constantly shifting amalgamation of every nightmare that had ever plagued sentient minds. One moment it appeared as a massive spider with too many eyes, the next as a void in space that sang with the voices of the damned. So small, the entity spoke without words, its communication bypassing language entirely to plant meaning directly into their minds. Two modes of existence, thinking to challenge the inevitable. I have consumed galaxies, little warriors. Your world is but another meal in an endless feast. Steve raised his shield, though he knew conventional tactics would be useless against such a foe. Beside him, Thor summoned lightning that crackled with the power of his guardian storms, but even Mjolnir's enchanted might seemed insignificant against the cosmic horror before them. Every world believes itself special, the Devourer continued, its form shifting to mock their defensive stances. Every civilization thinks its heroes can save them. I have heard 10,000 last cries from 10,000 dying worlds. Yours will be no different. The entity's first attack came not as physical force, but as pure despair given form. It struck Steve like a tidal wave of hopelessness, showing him visions of Earth consumed, of his friends falling one by one, of every person he had ever tried to protect dying in agony. The weight of cosmic futility pressed down on his shoulders, threatening to crush not just his body, but his very soul. But Steve Rogers had spent a lifetime carrying impossible burdens, and he had learned that hope wasn't about certainty of victory. Hope was about fighting even when defeat seemed inevitable, about standing up even when falling down would be easier. You're wrong, Steve said, his voice steady despite the psychic assault. Every world is special. Every life matters. And that's something a parasite like you will never understand. His shield sang through the air, its vibranium edge somehow finding purchase against the entity's shifting form. The Devourer recoiled, not from physical pain but from something far more damaging, the realization that its prey possessed something it could never consume. Thor joined the assault, his hammer crackling with divine fury. For Asgard, he roared, striking with the full might of the thunder god. For Midgard, for all the worlds you have stolen. The battle that followed transcended physical combat. Steve and Thor fought not just with weapons and strength, but with the very essence of what made them heroes. Every value they had ever held dear became a weapon against the cosmic darkness. Every sacrifice they had made a shield against despair. The Devourer struck back with increasing fury, its attacks becoming more desperate as it realized these opponents were unlike any it had faced before. It showed Steve visions of himself as an old man, alone and forgotten, his ideals dismissed by a world that had moved beyond heroes. It whispered that his sacrifices had been meaningless, that progress would have happened without him. Perhaps, Steve admitted, even as his shield deflected another reality-warping assault. But it happened with me. That's enough. The entity turned its attention to Thor, bombarding him with images of Asgard's destruction, of his father's disappointment, of his unworthiness to wield Mjolnir. But the Thunder God had faced such doubts before and emerged stronger for it. I am Thor Odinson, he declared, lightning dancing around his form like living poetry. I am worthy not because I am perfect, but because I choose to stand for others when they cannot stand for themselves. As the battle raged, Steve began to understand the true nature of their enemy. The Devourer wasn't just feeding on life force. It was consuming meaning itself. Every world it destroyed was not just a source of energy, but a victory over the concept that existence had purpose. It sought to prove that hope was an illusion, that heroism was meaningless in the face of cosmic indifference. But Steve had never needed the universe to validate his choices. He had learned long ago that meaning came not from external sources, but from the decision to keep fighting for what was right, even when the odds were impossible. You want to know what makes us different from every other world you've destroyed? Steve called out as he deflected another wave of despair. We don't fight because we know we'll win. We fight because it's the right thing to do. The Devourer's form began to waver, its confidence shaken by opponents who refused to accept defeat even in the face of cosmic horror. For the first time in eons, it felt something it had forgotten existed, uncertainty. Impossible. It raged, its attacks becoming wilder, less controlled. Hope is a lie. Purpose is an illusion. I have seen the heat death of universes. Then you've seen the end, Steve replied, pressing his attack even as his body screamed in agony from the dimensional energies. But you've never understood the beginning. You've never seen a child take their first steps, or watched someone choose to do right when wrong would be easier. Thor's hammer found its mark, striking the entity's core with the force of a collapsing star. But the real damage came not from physical force, but from the idea it represented. That power meant nothing without the will to use it in service of others. The Devourer's form began to collapse in on itself, its coherence failing as concepts it had tried to destroy proved more durable than cosmic horror. Steve felt the dimensional rifts beginning to seal, felt reality reasserting itself across the multiverse. But victory came at a price. The energies released by the entity's destruction were tearing the nightmare realm apart, and the pathway back to Earth was closing rapidly. Steve looked at Thor, seeing the same realization in his friend's ancient eyes. "We may not make it back," Thor said simply. Steve nodded, feeling a strange peace settle over him. He thought of Peggy, of Bucky, of all the people who had shaped him into the man he had become. They had given their lives for others, and now it was his turn to do the same. "Then we make sure our sacrifice saves them all," he replied. The spire began to crumble around them as reality reasserted its dominance over nightmare. Steve Rogers, the man out of time, prepared for his final act of heroism, knowing that sometimes the greatest victory was simply refusing to surrender, even in the face of impossible odds. The collapse of the nightmare realm created a cascade effect that rippled across dimensions. Steve felt the very fabric of reality trembling as the Devourer's death throes threatened to tear apart the barriers between worlds. The spire around them disintegrated into fragments of crystallized screams, each shard containing the final moments of some long-dead civilization. "The pathway!" Thor shouted over the dimensional storm, pointing toward a shrinking tear in space that led back to Earth. "We have perhaps seconds before it closes forever." Steve calculated the distance in an instant. They could make it, but barely, and only if nothing went wrong. But even as they ran toward their only hope of escape, Steve noticed something that made his blood freeze. The energy pattern of the collapsing realm was wrong, unstable in a way that suggested the destruction wouldn't stop with the nightmare dimension. "Thor, wait!" Steve called out, but his words were lost in the cosmic wind that howled around them. Then Steve saw it, a fragment of the Devourer's consciousness, a seed of corruption that was being pulled toward the pathway to Earth. If it made it through, if even that tiny piece of cosmic horror reached his world, it would begin the process all over again. The rifts would reopen, the nightmare would spread, and everything they had fought for would be meaningless. There was only one choice to make, and Steve Rogers made it without hesitation. He tackled Thor, sending the thunder god tumbling toward the pathway, while Steve himself spun away from safety. His shield flew from his hand as he grappled with the fragment of living darkness, his enhanced strength barely enough to contain something that existed beyond physical laws. "Steve, no." Thor's voice echoed across the collapsing dimension, but it was too late. The pathway snapped shut like a closing eye, leaving Steve alone with the last remnant of humanity's greatest enemy. The fragment fought against his grip with the fury of concentrated hatred. It showed him visions of Earth burning, of his friends dying in agony, of every heroic act he had ever performed being undone by cosmic indifference. But Steve had faced his demons in this realm before, and he understood now what he had to do. "You're right about one thing," he said to the writhing darkness in his hands. "Heroes die. Civilizations fall. Nothing lasts forever." The fragment seemed to pulse with triumph, thinking it had finally broken the legendary Captain America spirit. But Steve's grip only tightened. "But that doesn't make heroism meaningless," he continued. "It makes it precious. Every moment we choose hope over despair, every time we stand up for others, every act of kindness in the face of cosmic horror, those moments matter because they're finite. They matter because they're ours." The fragment began to writhe more desperately as Steve's words took on physical force in this realm where thought and reality were one. His shield, fallen but not forgotten, began to resonate with harmonic frequencies that matched his voice. "I've spent my whole life out of time," Steve said, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders. Always a man from the past, trying to fit into a future that moved too fast. But I understand now. Time isn't something you're stuck in. It's something you choose to make meaningful. The shield lifted from the collapsing ground, drawn by forces beyond magnetism or gravity. It spun through the dimensional storm, cutting through fragments of nightmare and despair until it came to rest in Steve's free hand. "This shield has protected millions of people," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "It's been carried by a man who believed that freedom was worth fighting for, worth dying for. But it was never about the shield. It was about what the shield represents." The fragment of the Devourer screamed without sound as Steve raised the vibranium disc above his head. But this wasn't an attack against the cosmic horror. It was something far more powerful. "It represents the idea that someone will always stand up," Steve declared. "That no matter how dark things get, no matter how hopeless the situation seems, someone will always choose to fight for what's right. Not because they know they'll win, but because losing doesn't matter as much as trying." The shield began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with its metallic properties. It shone with every life it had saved, every stand it had made, every moment when Steve Rogers had chosen to be more than just a man with enhanced abilities. "You want to know the secret of human hope?" Steve asked the writhing fragment. "We know everything ends. We know we're small and fragile and temporary. And we choose to care anyway. We choose to love anyway. We choose to fight anyway." With that declaration, Steve brought the shield down not in violence, but in absolution. The impact didn't destroy the fragment of the Devourer so much as transform it, converting cosmic hatred into something that had never existed in the nightmare realm: forgiveness. The fragment dissolved into particles of light that spread throughout the collapsing dimension, and where they touched, the screaming crystal structures became gentle music. The forests of bone-white trees burst into bloom with flowers that sang lullabies to the wounded cosmos. The very air itself seemed to sigh with relief as eons of accumulated suffering were finally allowed to heal. But the realm was still collapsing, and Steve felt the last of his strength leaving him. The dimensional energies had taken their toll on his enhanced physiology, and he could feel his consciousness beginning to fade. He thought of Peggy waiting for him in whatever came after, of Bucky's laugh on a Brooklyn afternoon that existed now only in memory, of all the people he had known and loved and lost. As the nightmare realm finally collapsed into itself, taking Steve Rogers with it, his last thought was not of regret or fear. It was of gratitude. Gratitude for a life lived in service to others, for the chance to make a difference, for the privilege of standing guard over hope itself. Across dimensions, in the real world, the rifts sealed themselves with finality that even cosmic forces could not overcome. Cities that had been on the brink of consumption found themselves safe, their skies clear of otherworldly horror. Heroes around the globe felt the sudden absence of the dimensional threat and knew that somehow, impossibly, the crisis was over. In London, Thor stood on Westminster Bridge, tears streaming down his face as he held Steve's shield. It had appeared moments after the rifts closed, materializing in the exact spot where they had entered the nightmare realm. The vibranium surface bore no new scratches, but it seemed somehow lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted from it. "He saved us all," Thor whispered to the wind. "Steve Rogers gave everything so that others might live. He made the ultimate sacrifice, not in despair, but in hope." The shield would find its way to the Smithsonian, where it would be displayed with honor and reverence. Children would press their noses against the glass case, listening to stories of the man who had carried it. The legend of Captain America would live on, inspiring new generations to stand up for what was right. But in the space between dimensions, in the quantum foam that existed between realities, something more precious than legend endured. Steve Rogers had not just saved his world, he had redeemed the very concept of sacrifice itself. His final act had proved that even cosmic horror could be answered with human nobility, that even in the face of infinite darkness, one person choosing to do right could make all the difference. The soldier's last cry had not been one of pain or fear. It had been a declaration that hope would always find a way to survive, that heroism would always rise to meet the darkness, and that as long as someone was willing to stand up for others, the universe would never truly be lost. In the end, Steve Rogers had done what he had always done. He had protected those who could not protect themselves. And in doing so, he had become something more than a hero. He had become a beacon of possibility that would shine across all realities, proof that even the smallest acts of courage could echo through eternity. The man out of time had finally found his place in history, not as a relic of the past, but as an eternal guardian of humanity's future.